Mystery and Deceit, From Earth to Mars. Book 1 of Chaos's Orbit Saga. Written by James T. Hall. Narrated by Chris Pullman. Episode 1. Meeting Eric. As many of you know, I am, or rather was after the events that have transpired, a reporter for the New Chicago Times. One day a few years ago I was conducting field research for a local interest piece I was doing on a local pub and eatery by the name of L&H. The bar got its name from its original owners, Laura and Hank. That day I had gone to talk to Hank Jr. and see what I could dig up that wasn't in land or tax records. As it happened, I'd find out more than I ever could have imagined. As an aside, I did eventually finish the article. It appears in the first appendix of this book. But I digress. While at L&H, Hank Jr. helped introduce me to some of his regular patrons. For a Wednesday lunch hour, the place was fairly full. As I was chatting with a small group at one end of the bar, a man walked in and sat at the other. His gray hair was spiked back in that way reminiscent of a hedgehog. Pulling up a chair, the man sat and flagged down Hank. Despite a firm jawline, the man appeared in his mid to late 60s. Once Hank was again free, I caught his attention. As he approached, I asked, "Who's that guy?" indicating the newcomer. Rolling his stogie in his mouth a moment before responding, Hank took a long draw from it, slowly exhaled, and said, "Greg Pace. He's a professor over at New Madison. Comes in Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays." "Would he be a good source?" I asked. Hank laughed in his typical way, making it seem like the laugh came from his knees. "Sure he would. But he never talks to anyone." "Not even you to order?" I asked with a smile. Hank hadn't been hard to dial in. As such, my comment hit home, as it was meant to, eliciting another chuckle from Hank. "Fair enough," he replied. "You're stubborn enough. You might just get something out of him. Come on," Hank added, gesturing for me to follow him down the bar. As we approached the man, Greg, he looked up. His eyes passed from Hank to me and then back down into his drink. I felt a slight tugging sensation on my head then, something I would come to understand later. At the time, I simply ignored it as I pulled up a seat next to Greg. "Greggy," Hank said, resting a hand on the bar in front of the man. "This here's James Hall of the New Chicago Times. He's doing a piece here on L&H. Was curious if you'd be willing to talk to him." Greg looked into Hank's eyes, saying, "Would you like me to, Hank?" "I think it'd help the boy's story if you did," Hank replied. Greg first turned his head toward me, keeping his eyes on Hank. Snapping his eyes to me, he said, "You're right about one thing, Hank. My talking to him would definitely do some good to his story." The strange tugging at my head had returned. "Shall we, Mr. Hall?" Greg asked, gesturing at the booth opposite us on the exterior wall. Nodding, I followed as Greg moved over. "And how's the meal looking, Hank?" Greg called. "Gonna be a bit of a wait today, Greggy. Lunch rush and all." Greg nodded, saying to me, "He always says that. Sometimes he's right and I end up getting lunch to go. We'll see how things go today. So, Mr. Hall, what can I do for you?" "Well, as Hank said, I'm doing a piece on L&H. Are you familiar with my work?" Greg shook his head. I was already starting to put him in focus, though. He wasn't being completely honest. "Well, I do mostly local interest pieces for the Times. Overall, I enjoy the work as it helps me to really connect with the people in the community." "And what, pray tell, made you interested in L&H?" "Well, Greg, it was the upcoming Exile Day." He had been about to sip from his drink, but paused with the glass almost to his lip. "What relevance does L&H have to that?" he asked, finishing the motion. "Well, by the land records I uncovered, enough. This bar sits on the oldest registered plot of land in Olympus Mons province, and in talking with some of the other patrons, some of whom I assume you know have been regulars here for decades, they suggest that New Chicago grew up around L&H. Since New Chicago was the first settlement on Mars, it is the oldest surviving piece of human history here, save, of course, for those stories about surviving members of the TDF, I added, intentionally using the shortened form of the Terran Defense Force's name. I had a feeling that Greg knew something about the TDF and or their exile here to Mars. Being a hero, or one who believes that the TDF were wrongly exiled to Mars from Earth, I tended to be able to pick out other heroes with a certain amount of accuracy. Ignoring my comment about the TDF momentarily, Greg harumphed. First settlement. Well, that is unless you count Eric Pullman and his ilk as settlers. But those exiles have long been written off as lost, I said. If you don't believe the wild rumors, that is. I mean, after all, when the founders of New Chicago began to arrive here almost 250 years ago, they found no trace of those exiles. Just a terraformed planet. And how could there have been any survivors after over 2 centuries without contact? Mars, when they arrived, was a wasteland, worse than an inhospitable planet. Obviously, they put something into motion here that made it habitable. But if they had survived, surely there would have been some sign of them. As I'm sure you know, all the settlers found was clear land and earth-like foliage. I caught a very slight, knowing smile on Greg's face. It was gone so quickly that most would not have even noticed it. There's truth in that, Greg replied. So what are you hoping to gain from me, Sonny? A little support, quote for yet another rote piece on how we've made it without the TDF all these years, and see how much better we are for it, he said as he looked and gestured around the bar sarcastically. Not at all, sir. On this rather auspicious anniversary, I thought it'd be nice to put things into perspective. I mean, if it weren't for their founding work in terraforming this planet, we could never have settled here. And as this is the oldest structure known to exist on Mars, it's a logical point from which to springboard such a discussion. Greg harumphed again, sipping from his glass. I'm curious, Greg, I said, switching tracks. Do you know Tim Fowler? He's a history professor at NMU. Can't say I do. What does he teach? Earth history. Specializes in the period from 700 years ago until the Martian settlement. Greg subtly stilled, his demeanor changing slightly. I was an apt pupil of his, especially interested in the study of Atmo. Greg's grip on his glass tightened somewhat. Do you know anything about Atmo, Greg? He stared hard into my eyes for a moment before saying, No. You're lying, I replied immediately and softly. I can read people. You didn't flinch at my use of TDF. You knew damn well about their prior settlement here. And you're also, I would suspect, a hero based on your satirical portrayal of most Exile Day-related articles. I happen to agree with you in regards to that, by the way. They're just all rubbish. Do you know what you've just admitted to? Greg asked me a moment after a pause. Of course. In an age of censorship without oversight, when the censors can make people disappear for almost anything, I just put myself on the hook. Greg, I have the feeling that you're a hero too, and that you have much to share. That's the only way our kind keeps history from being erased entirely. The only way we keep the Department of Censorship from utterly succeeding. The government provides us with all the history we need about the period surrounding the TDF's time on Earth, Greg said, a measuring look on his face. What do you say to that? The Department of Censorship provides us with a sanitized history. The TDF, when mentioned at all, are labeled traitors to humanity, butchers. Never mentioned is the good they did, the help in rebuilding they began, nor, I said, pulling my trump card, does their version of history tell the whole truth. What of the TDF's true origins? What about Project Plymouth? Few among heroes knew anything about Project Plymouth, fewer still that it linked into both TDF and Atmo. The project, from what sources I had seen, was where the original leaders of Atmo first met. As a topic, the project was one of, if not the most heavily suppressed by the censors. Even an errant Google search would certainly land a censor team at your door. Greg, in response to my mention of the project, choked mid-slip. My God, man, he said between coughs. Even here you shouldn't mention that name aloud. As I've said, the project is highly censored. Why, though, LNH should be any safer in regards to the discussion of any hero topic, I didn't know. Even so, I pressed, you know something about it, or else my mentioning it would mean nothing to you. Greg glanced around the room quickly. You know as well as I that these are not safe topics to be discussing in public, Greg said firmly, his gaze returning to me. I agree, but would still like to discuss them if you're willing. My card, I said as I pulled an embossed business card from my note tab folio. Greg took it, flicking it with a finger from his other hand. Hardly anyone used physical business cards anymore, so it made me stand out. Now, though, if you do have some information you could share about LNH, I'd be all ears. Greg looked at me once more with his measuring stare. Sorry, kid, but we're done for now, Greg said as he rose, returning with his drink to the bar. I knew there would be nothing more to gain from pressing Greg just now. It was a reasonable response, and one I had run into before. Such a person as I was would be in a perfect position to be a censor. With the Department of Censorship at its most powerful, one had always to tread with caution. Instead, I returned to the groups I had been chatting with prior to Greg's entrance. As we continued to talk, I worked in questions about the man Greg. The other patrons knew he was a professor at MNU and was part of the biophysics department. Past that, though, they didn't know much. As I circulated among other regulars, continuing to inquire about LNH and Greg, I only grew more intrigued about the man. Many patrons said, only half-jokingly, that Greg had actually been around longer than LNH and could swear either seeing him in hollow pics from their parents or else remembered hearing stories of someone matching his description from even further back. For those readers less well versed in Terran Martian history, it is worthwhile here to briefly touch on the subject. While a student at New Madison University, home of the Fighting Phoenix, my primary focus was clearly journalism. However, thanks to several excellent history professors, I developed a keen interest in the subject. My senior project for Tim Fowler, one of my professors, brought together my historical research and journalistic sides. I had grown increasingly interested in the time period starting at the War of Noble Cause on mid-21st century Earth. Of course, War of Noble Cause is the name given the global insurrection by the United Terran Government and its pet dog, the Department of Censorship. The war, started by a renegade element of the TDF, sought to overthrow the legitimate global Terran government. Eric Pullman, in addition to James and Melinda Christopher, Adam Green, Meng Tao, Claire Jakes, Jessica Brune, and DeAndre Freeman, and their organization known as ATMO, which formed the core of the TDF, stood in opposition to the insurrection. However, by the end of the war, enough propaganda had been brought to bear against the TDF that they were forced into exile on Mars. That was almost 500 years ago. When settlement of Mars began in true some 300 years ago, necessitated by the sudden attractiveness of Martian mansions for the ultra-wealthy, the first settlers found no trace of the TDF exiles. Instead, they found a terraformed planet ready for habitation. My senior project for Tim focused largely on reconstructing both the pre- and war-era TDF, as well as tracing their influence in more recent times. For reference, I have included that project as well as its sources in the last two appendices of this book. Thus, largely thanks to Tim's openness to me in being a heroer, as well as his support during my research, I became an adamant supporter of the cause. Likewise, the chance to do research as part of my job on a place like LNH that was clearly so connected to the history that flowed from the TDF intrigued me. And since those of us who were heroes and supporters of the underground were growing fewer in number every year, thanks to renewed and increased scrutiny by the censors, meeting another of our kind was incredibly important, especially finding one who knew about Project Plymouth. As I've already mentioned, very few people have even heard of the project, fewer still that it somehow ties into both ATMO and the TDF. For all these reasons, the man Greg intrigued me to no end. I had to find out more about him. While I was talking to yet another group of regulars, I saw Greg tell Hank something, then get up and leave. Catching my attention, Hank gestured me over to the bar. Excusing myself, I went and sat next to where Greg had been. Told me to give you this, Hank said, sliding a Jameson and Classic Coke my way. Don't know that I've ever seen the man buy anyone a drink before. Must have made one hell of an impression on him, Hank added as he walked away. It was the same drink Greg had been enjoying. I lifted it, the napkin underneath sticking for a moment before fluttering down to the bar. As it did, it opened to reveal writing. Hank, I said, lifting the napkin while setting down the drink. Yes, he drawled as he came back over. You know where Greg lives? Over on Lime Kiln Road, I think, Hank replied. There on the napkin was written 242 Lime Kiln, 10 a.m. sharp. You said he comes here Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays? Yep, replied Hank. Somehow manages to keep a teaching schedule restricted to those days and stops here afterward. Thanks, Hank, I said, slamming the drink, suddenly needing it. Getting up, I added, I'll send over a copy of my final draft before it goes to press. Sounds good, Jimmy. Don't be a stranger. I won't, Hank, and thanks again. I could feel the drink beginning to work, even as my car pulled itself out of the L&H parking lot toward my apartment. I had to dig, find out what I could about Greg Pace. He had left me the sort of invitation I had wanted. The man had information to share, that much was obvious, and if he knew of Project Plymouth, that information would be worthwhile. Once home, I logged into my work's databases, pulling on those stores to find anything about Greg. Professor at NMU. Knew that. Doctoral degree granted internally. Former employee of S&N Industries in their biocomputer division. A heavily redacted article popped up. As a journalist, a certain amount of such digging was permitted by the censors, or else just looking up such an article would raise a red flag. What remained in the article described some sort of research into illicit technology cultivated by a group of independent scientists headed by Gregory Pace. Not only was he a hero, but one who had survived being on the censor's radar for some decades. It only reinforced for me what Greg could share with me would be very important. How important, though, I could not have imagined at the time. Mystery and Deceit, From Earth to Mars, Book 1 of Chaos's Orbit Saga. Written by James T. Hall, narrated by Chris Pullman. Episode 1, Meeting Eric. Visit us online at www.narclaninc.com to link up with us.